Today is Friday, May 16th, 2014, and we are in Bellingham, Massachusetts. This tape is part of the Bellingham Mendon Veterans Oral History Project. My name is Marjorie Turner Holman. Our cameraman is Eric Fisher of ABMI Cable 8 TV. We are privileged to have with us today Wayne Morey of Bellingham, Massachusetts. Wayne, please tell us your full name and birth date.
It's Wayne S. Morey, and I was born on August 8, 1938.
And what is your hometown?
My hometown is Milford, Massachusetts. I have lived there most of my life, and other than my time in the service or when I was away with IBM, I've never lived more than one town away from Milford. I've lived in Upton, I've lived in Hopkinton, and now Bellingham.
Okay. Well, tell us about some members of your family who have served in the military.
Yes, I have two older brothers that served in the Navy as well as myself.
There they are up on the screen. Yeah.
My two older brothers joined the Naval Reserves first, and as soon as I turned 17, while I was still in high school, I joined the Naval Reserves, and the location was in Woonsocket, Rhode Island at the time. So every Friday night we would go down to Woonsocket and go through the drills and the training exercises to learn the necessary skills for the Navy.
Okay. I think you talked to me about your father was also, he was a military man.
No, my father actually part of the family, the Morey family that had the farm on Purchase Street in Milford, and at the time of the wars, my father was a necessary trade here and therefore did not serve in the Army or any military.
Okay, good. Okay, well, and remind me, why did you choose to go in the Navy, Wayne?
Well, I think there really was two basic reasons. The first was growing up on a farm. We lived a good life, but we certainly were not rich. And we were rich in the enjoyments of a family, but monetarily, the future for college or some other training really was not in the budget. So the military became a good option. And we lived part of my life on a lake, Lake Maspinock, or some people know it as North Pond. It's partly in Milford, partly in Upton, partly in Hopkinton. So the water always was something that I enjoyed, so the Navy was the first thought. So I joined as soon as I turned 17, and actually during my senior year in high school, I would be attending every Friday night the drills down in Woonsocket.
I think we have a picture of you, boot camp picture. There you are.
Yes.
Is that when you had first signed up?
Now that picture there actually shows me when I had obtained the rating of a fire control technician, second class. Okay. My boot camp pictures somewhere along the way have kind of got lost or whatever.
Well, what can you tell us about your boot camp experience?
Well, I had rather a unique boot camp experience because being in the Naval Reserves, you had to go to 2 weeks of boot camp in Bainbridge, Maryland. So actually during my senior year in high school, I had to go to Bainbridge, Maryland for 2 weeks and leave school. And at first the school had questions about being gone for 2 weeks, but when they realized that it was legitimate and it was for the Navy, there was no issue, and they were very supportive of me. So I went through a modified, if you will, boot camp for those 2 weeks.
And let's see, did you have any further boot camp training, or was that it?
Towards the end of my senior year in high school, I realized that I had signed up for what was then brand new, a 6-year military obligation with the reserves. Because I was committed to go into the reserves, the Navy, they had me for 2 years. And with 2 years, I was not able to go to a school of my choosing. So I happened to be talking to the Navy recruiter at the post office one day, and he said, well, why don't you join the regular Navy? And so I took the tests, and I was guaranteed that I could go to electronics school, which is what I wanted. And I went in on a kind of an unusual journey. They refer to it as a minority cruise, or sometimes it's commonly called a kiddie cruise. And basically you go in the Navy while you're 17 and you get out the day before you're 21. So when I went into the regular Navy, not the reserves, but when I went in the regular Navy on active duty, actually went to Worcester and then to Springfield, and they determined that I had passed the very first rating already in the reserves, and I was considered a prior serviceman. So I did not have to go to boot camp again. And I actually then went into the Fargo building and waited for assignment to the school.
Okay. Now, when you were on active duty, besides the Fargo building, where were you stationed?
Well, my first assignment while I was in school was in Great Lakes, Illinois. I spent approximately a year out there. I went through basic electronics school, which was a very intensive schooling. And then they had a class for particular types of systems that was on a ship. And I had actually signed up in electronics, but it was called fire control technician. And when first told that I was going to be a fire control technician, I was a little disappointed. I said, you know, I wanted electronics. And they kind of laughed and said, you don't realize what a fire control technician is, do you? They said, it has nothing to do with fires. And I said, oh, thank goodness. So it actually was electronics. So I went through the basic training there of electronics, and then an advanced school on the radar and computers and the various components of the fire control system, which actually controls the firing of the guns. So that's how I really got in. So it took about a year for those 2 schools.
And then where were you posted?
Well, I was fortunate. The fire control problem, if you will, and that is the determination of all the angles and everything else as to how to control the guns, is basically trigonometry. And that was a weak subject for me. And I had an instructor that wouldn't accept that excuse, and he just kept after me, making me answer questions, keeping me after classes, going through. And as a result of his dedication to his students, I would say, I ended up being first in the class. And therefore, I had my pick of any one of the open assignments that they had. And one of the open assignments was the USS Lady out of Rhode Island.
And we have a picture of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a CBS, which basically is a carrier that specialized in anti-submarine type of activities. The carrier would, when we were at sea, we would have the complete air crew on there, and the pilots and the planes, and they would go out and drop sonar buoys looking for any submarines that might be out there, and and then bring the data back, and we would do whatever was necessary.
Now, you told me about some unusual ways that you use the radar, like with docking and things. Can you explain that to us?
When I first started, I was a radar operator, and that actually, if you look at the hangar deck, that's like the first deck, and as you go higher, there's an O in front of it. So I was up in the 07 level, which is high up on the ship with the radar and the aft controller was. And I would operate the radar so that we had one person that would maneuver the controller in the general direction, and then one person that controlled the vertical and one person that would control the horizontal. I, as the radar operator, would find that blip on the screen, and when it was a good signal, I would tell them to lock in, which basically put everything into automatic at that point in time. And all that was fed to the computer down on the 7th deck, actually 06 deck, I'm sorry. And we have something that is called general quarters, and of course we practice that a lot in case of the day that you ever really had a situation. And fortunately, we never really had a severe situation that we had to be concerned with. But in the beginning, as a radar operator, my general quarter station was down with a computer. So I actually had 13 decks from the 07 down to the 6th deck in order to get there. And quite often, doors would be secure, so I would have to go through various hatches, crawling through tunnels to get to where my station was. Eventually, they changed my general quarters station so that I always then was the radar operator. We also had something else that's referred to as sea detail, and that is when the carrier is leaving port or entering a port, and the captain don't just really get up there and say, let's go and steer by sight. It's a very precise maneuver, and the radar for the fire control radar was extremely accurate. So he would have targets, and he would want us to lock on a particular target so that he could get ranges and bearings, so that as he's looking at his charts, he can judge exactly where he is so that he can maneuver the ship. So for the first year or so, I would be the radar operator, and I would be the one that would be locking in on the targets for him. Eventually, One day there was a person that was ill that couldn't make it, and they asked me to be what they call the captain's talker. That's the person that's on the bridge with the captain, and as he asks for range and bearings, you're talking back to the controller to where the operator, now the radar operator, had logged on to a target, so you're the one giving him the range and bearings. That's the reason they call it the captain's talker, because you're doing the talking, telling him.
Is that considered a more responsible job?
Yes, it was. And it became a job that I became very familiar with the captain. And so in all the ports that we would go in, I typically knew what targets that he would want. And we had two controllers, one in the forward part of the ship and one in the aft part of the ship. And whichever one was not active at the time, I would have to lock on to the next target. So as soon as the captain would say, change targets, I would be there. And the next thing I knew, the captain said, I want Morey here as my talker. So for the rest of the time when we were active, I served as the captain's talker.
So you were able to anticipate. You were able to anticipate what the captain needed, and so that
yes.
expedited everything.
You get to know exactly what type of targets, and of course in a familiar port you knew exactly what they were. If you were in an unfamiliar port, you could anticipate what targets he typically would want. Sometimes you may not be totally in sync with him, but you could quickly get to the one that he wanted.
Okay. In the talk we had prior to this meeting, you explained something about helping with space launches, when there were space launches. Can you explain that to us?
Yes. At the time when they had the space launches, of course, we still had the Soviet Union, and a lot of people, including Ronald Reagan, classified them as the evil empire. And so it was our Cold War foe. And
what period of time was this that you were?
I was in between 1956, 1959.
Okay.
And so we would be in the general area down in Florida where the launches would be taking place, or sometimes they would be in other locations. We would be around and just basically searching to make sure there were no submarines that maybe could be looking or gaining any information that they did not want. And it was a peacetime operation, and fortunately we never really had incidents that caused any concern.
Now, where was your ship based that you would go to Florida to do this?
We were based out of Quonset Point, Rhode Island. But if we went along the Atlantic coast, we might dock in Norfolk, Virginia, or sometimes in Mayport, Florida. That was typically the ports that we would go to on the East Coast. Although one time for a special celebration, we actually went down the St. Lawrence River to Montreal, Canada. And that was quite an experience because, of course, it's affected with tide. And the captain really had to know exactly where he was at all times. And sometimes we had to actually stop and wait for the tide before we could proceed. And again, as I mentioned, that typically was called sea detail. So the sea detail for going into that particular was 20 hours, and I spent the 20 hours on the bridge as well as the captain. But fortunately, when the captain wanted coffee, he had two coffees brought, one for me and one for him. And when he wanted to eat, I ate the same thing that he was eating. So it wasn't really any type of punishment. It was a good exercise, just being up for 20 hours, that's all.
And what was the purpose of going into the Gulf of St. Lawrence?
Canada had a celebration going on. I don't remember exactly now what it was, but there were some United States ships that went to Montreal to help participate in their particular celebration. It was a celebration type of event, a very positive type of event.
Okay. Could you describe a little of what life was aboard the carrier for you?
Life aboard a carrier, a lot of people refer to it as a floating city, and it really does come close to that. They're huge. We were not quite 1,000 feet long. The carriers of today are much longer than we were. And there's many decks above and below, and you have to learn exactly where you are, where you're going, which takes some time. And the meals were always an enjoyment because there would be certain times when your particular division was scheduled to go eat, and you would go to the mess hall. You always would be waiting in a line, not long, but there always was a line. That's how many people there would be when you were out to sea. And when you got down to where the food was, we always had about 3 choices. So you really ate very well. And the only requirement that they ever had was take what you want, but eat what you take. And they used to have someone stationed by the garbage pails to make sure when you were emptying your tray, there was not a lot of food that was on the tray. They didn't care how much you ate, but they cared if you wasted the food.
Showers, things like
yes.
that?
Showers, most of the time, we would have hot showers and fresh water. They had desalination units aboard the ship, which would convert, when we were at sea, the salt water to fresh water. But showers was basically a luxury, and again, it was a case of don't waste water. Mm-hmm. So you would wet down and then turn the water off, soap down, and then basically rinse off. So it's not the luxury that you would have at home of taking a 20-minute shower. It was a short, but you actually would be able to be thoroughly clean. You just didn't waste the water. That was the main point. We had what the Navy, we called a gidunk stand, which basically in today's world you could compare it to like a convenience store, and where you could buy all types of candy. You could buy food if you wanted some snacks or whatever. You could get sodas. If you smoked, you could buy cigarettes. And of course, if we were out to sea, the price of cigarettes were very, very inexpensive, like $1 for a carton of cigarettes, believe it or not, back then.
Mm-hmm. I think we have a picture of your whole division.
That's a picture of my division with division officers and our chief.
And where are you in that picture?
I am in the back row up there.
On the right or the left?
Yeah. I'm going to guess from the picture here. I can't see it that well, but I think the second from the left-hand side.
Okay. All right. Anything else you want to tell us about what life was like aboard a ship that Um,
Uh, Life aboard ship was easy in some ways because you had the luxury of excellent food. Of course, you had your bunks with a small mattress, but that was better than some people in other ships and other locations. Maybe the army that's sleeping on the ground, and you had your mattress. So life aboard ship was very good, and they really emphasized you don't waste. So when it came to water, you did not waste. When it came to food, you do not waste. When it comes to your time, you do not waste. During working hours, you were expected to work. Always was time to take a break, have a cup of coffee or whatever, but you really didn't just hang around. You were expected to work, and of course at the end of the working day, then you could rest, relax, and do what you wanted. And probably the most popular thing in our particular division was playing cards, and pinochle was the favorite game of our particular division.
were you very good at it?
I became very good at it, yes. It's something that when you play a particular game a lot, you really enjoy.
Any unusual incidents that happened while you were at sea that you want to
We had one
describe?
that I consider very unusual. We were cruising along on the Atlantic seaboard, and actually all of a sudden the ship was like it struck something, and there was a big shuddering of it, and we were concerned at the time, what is it? And lo and behold, we found out that the ship had hit a sperm whale.
Oh, we have a picture of that.
And unfortunately for the sperm whale, it did not survive. At the time,
How big do you figure that was?
I forget the exact, but I'm going to guess that was probably in the vicinity of 20 feet. And probably not a huge whale as far as, I don't know the exact size that sperm whales get to be, but I know they're not the largest type of whale. But after a few days, they noticed there was a slight leak, and actually it did crack a weld, and we did have to go into Norfolk, Virginia for a quick repair. No dry dock or anything. It was something that they could take care of pretty quick.
Any other incidents with the aircraft or?
Yeah, we had some things that you might consider funny, and then some things that were tragic or sad. One time, being a carrier, we obviously had planes that are taking off and landing when we're out at sea. And typically they have a tail hook, and they grab onto a cable running across the width of the deck, flight deck, and it would grab on that, and it's meant to give way and slow the aircraft down. And if there ever was a problem with that arresting gear, typically the tail hook on the plane would break off, and they had a crash barrier that was like a netting that would go up so that the plane could go in there, and it would sustain minor damage, but it would not be a severe situation. And one day we had a plane come in, and the arresting gear did not let go loose, and the tail hook did not break off. But the engine in front of the pilot and the whole rest of the plane just went flying down the deck, and there you saw the pilot sitting there with nothing in front of him. And that was one of the ones that I considered the more humorous type of situations. And when we were in the North Atlantic, up pretty far north, we actually never did get to the Arctic Circle. Very close. We always hoped we would, because there's a ceremony if you cross that, but we did not. And we had a helicopter that was taking off, and as it took off, it just had been refueled, obviously, and as it was taking off, it went into a condition that they call ground resonance. And that basically is the vibrations of the ship and the vibrations of the helicopter become at a particular frequency, so they really get into harmonic, and it will take and just literally shake the helicopter, and it come back down, and it was maybe 6 feet off the deck and crashed, and which we lost everyone on board the helicopter. So the pilot, the co-pilot, and a crew member unfortunately died. But being fueled, it quickly spread across the flight deck, and we had life rafts that were inflatable life rafts all along the side of the flight deck, and the aviation fuel quickly caught on them and started a fire. And we actually had 2 destroyers, smaller type ship that always accompanied us, that was on either side spraying foam and water, as well as our own firefighting equipment. And it took about an hour to put that fire out. And sometimes when you tell somebody that you had a fire that took over an hour or about an hour to put out, and it's a steel ship, or what can burn. But actually all the coats of paint that are on that ship are very flammable, as well as it's moving back and forth. And in our case, it caught the life rafts, and I'm sure other situations. That was a scary moment for a lot of us at that time.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, people died.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'd love to have you talk about some of the travels that you did when you were in the Navy. You got away from Milford. You didn't just get...
Right. Our basic routine was 2 weeks out, 2 weeks in, out of Quonset Point. But you always had to take a cruise somewhere for practice, and also for support for another ship that maybe had been there but now was going back to its home port for a rest. So we went to the Mediterranean. We had been down in the Caribbean, and probably the best cruise we had, we were anchored out of England and out of London area, but I don't, probably in the river there, but we could not tie up. So we would have to take a Liberty, what they call a Liberty launch, or a boat, to go back and forth to go on Liberty. So we spent some time in England, we spent some time in Spain, we spent some time in Lisbon, Portugal.
I think we have a picture of you abroad there.
Yes, I'm not exactly sure what city we were in at the time, but that was 3 of my shipmates that were in our division. That I'm going to guess that it might have been out of Norfolk, or it could have been even out of New York.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because we also had docked in New York.
I was going to say there's English in there, so that's an English-speaking?
Yeah, I doubt that
Okay.
was overseas.
Okay. All right.
Uh,
But tell us about some of you went to places where people didn't speak English.
yes, quite a few places. Lisbon, Portugal, which was a beautiful place to visit. And unless you knew Spanish, which unfortunately I did not, it would be very difficult to communicate. And so you quickly learned, if you wanted to get around or whatever, you would pick up a few words, and then with gestures and pointing, and for instance, if you, food, you might emphasize the word food, and then like, I want to eat, and pretty soon people would understand exactly what you were talking about, and you get to go where you wanted and do what you wanted. So I think sign language and communications become second nature to you. At least it did to me.
Are you saying even if you were walking on the street, you could ask people where do you
Yes.
go to eat? Or?
Yes. Not every person would you be able to communicate with, but you always found somebody that was willing to take a few moments to understand what it was that you wanted, and then point. And a lot of times, rather than point, they might actually motion to you to follow me, and they would bring you to where it was that you wanted to go.
Very nice. Well, after you left the Navy, what was tell us about that first assignment that you had.
Well, actually, before I left the Navy, probably one of the most enjoyable times for my father was when I was in the Navy and we were stationed down. I was stationed down in Quonset Point, Rhode Island, and we lived on Upton side of Lake Maspinock, and it was a nice area. Fishing and cookouts and whatever, and pretty soon a lot of the guys that were in my division would come home with me on a weekend, and before we would hit the house they would stop at a grocery store. In fact, if I remember, it used to be an A&P up off of 140 by 140 West Street in Milford, and buy a lot of food and come to the house so that my parents never had to worry about how we're going to feed these guys. They always brought a lot. My father enjoyed that because with 3 sons in the Navy, even though it was peacetime, there always is a concern whenever your child is away in the military, regardless of the circumstances. So actually, after I retired and I started on my first job, I interviewed with IBM, and the electronics training that I had from the Navy gave me the door into IBM, which was a 31.5-year experience, working experience for me. So I really credit the Navy with giving me the training to be able to go into a company like IBM and to be very successful in the company. There's a lot of things I can look back and look at my Navy training and see where they really have helped you in life in general. So for me, the Navy was a wonderful, positive experience.
Now, you talked about going to Minot, South Dakota. Could you talk just a little bit about
Yes,
that experience?
When I first got hired by IBM, I spent about the first year in Kingston, New York, and going to school. and the school was for locations throughout the northern part of the United States. And when I finished up with that school, then my assignment ended up being in Minot, North Dakota. And we were actually worked at the air base. And again, it's the era of the Soviet Union, not Russian Federation, but the Soviet Union. And so there was radar stations in Canada, in Alaska, all across the northern part, and they would feed into various stations, and Minot, North Dakota happened to be one, in which we would track all the information from the radar, and they would determine whether they felt there was any threat, and always, of course, looking for something like a missile. And of course, in those days, if there was a missile, it would have been a slow-moving type of missile, something that they could have taken action against. But I think more specifically, they were looking at for planes. So I used to work, it would be a rotating shift. You would work a third shift, and then a second shift, and then a first shift, and you'd work 6 days and then 2 days off. So your days off always would be varying. And I worked in an area where we had, which probably in those days was something unusual, but certainly not top secret today, because the technology is quite old. But it would have a screen with the images of the radar, and this Calvin Hughes machine would take a picture, move it, spray chemicals on it to develop it, and move it, and then they would be displayed up on a large screen so that the generals and whoever in the Air Force was looking at it had a big screen operation of what was going on. Pretty archaic in today's technology, but in those days it was pretty good. And we
was like it produced an instant movie, sort of like an instant movie type of a thing?
An instant movie, but with a minute delay, if you will.
But that was all?
It was just a minute delay, yeah. 30 seconds in the, or actually 60 seconds combined in the 3 different stations that it would go through, including the chemicals and then the final drying before it got projected.
Okay, wow.
And that was, you know, a very exciting type of thing. But the computers, we had 2 computers, basically one that was in operation, and the other one we would have for maintenance, and it was tubes. And part of the maintenance was you would shut the lights out and walk down looking at all the tubes to see if you saw a burnt out tube. And if you did, everything was duplicated, so you could pull that particular unit out while it was on maintenance, put one in, and just check it out. But that was part of the maintenance back in those days of the tube technology. And then the next day it would switch over to the other computer, and you'd go through the same routine. So it was sophisticated for the time, but again, today you would consider it archaic as far as technology goes.
I seem to remember you talking about mechanical computers when you were on board ship.
When I was aboard ship, yes, the computers we had worked a lot with what they call synchros and servers, and basically they're 2 units similar to a motor, if you will, only instead of running all the time, either a control manual or an electronic signal, would move it, and that signal would be transmitted in some cases, like 13 decks, down to the computer room, and the synchro would lock in. So they work together, synchro server. One would move and the other would move. And the computer was basically mechanical, synchro servos, analog, a lot of different technologies, but the heart of the computer really was mechanical. And when you stop to think that the fire control problem is based on trigonometry, then you can understand why something mechanical could really work very well in those days.
So it was almost more like a calculator of sorts, or?
It was more than a calculator. It was a really sophisticated calculator, and one that could predict future circumstances. So,
okay. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how some of the ways that you've given back to the community with teaching conversational English and some of those experiences with your travels and.
Well, I think a lot of times in my career with IBM, I would always be helping out in some way or another. Junior Achievement was one project that IBM sponsored, and a lot of times I would help out with that. But mainly after I left IBM, for the first 4 years after I left IBM, I actually was in a pizza restaurant business. And so there was little time to really be doing much then. And after we sold the business, and I kind of went back into high tech, I worked for quite a few different companies. And in 2003, I had a serious infection. It was a staph infection in the spinal column. And they will never be able to figure out how it happened, but it happened. And the slightest abrasion on your skin, if the right bacteria gets there in the right circumstances, you can get anything, and so it's something difficult to say. But I spent like about 38 days in the hospital and about 3 weeks in Whittier rehab, and come home and had a pump on my side that pumped antibiotics, that you had to change the antibiotics and the batteries every day. So it kind of gave you a different outlook on life. And I consequently, the following year after that, I had to have a operation on my back. And at that point in time, I had really spent too much time away from work, and they had to get somebody that could be there. So I retired at that point in time. I was probably 68 or so at the time, so well past 65. And I started looking for places to volunteer, and what came to my mind was the Soviet Union. By now, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and now was the Russian Federation with a lot of former Soviet Union countries now independent. And I had a big interest in them. And so I volunteered with a group out of England called Projects Abroad. And I taught conversational English I taught in St. Petersburg, Russia, and I taught in Chisinau, Moldova. And the whole idea of conversational English is you're not an English instructor, it's not formal English. What you're trying to do is to get the students, and the students could be adults, and I've had it as young as Stas, who was in the first grade. That was my student. So it really varied in ages dramatically who you would be teaching. And the benefit of someone like myself is that you do not know their language. And therefore it really becomes, quote, immersion type of training. And I've noticed in my teachings when I would be with other volunteers, the ones that knew the language of the country, a lot of times when they would be teaching, they would be asked a question in the language of the country, and they'd be responding in the language of the country, and English kind of got put by the wayside, where in my circumstances, I did not know the language of the country. So you really had to speak. And you go through a lot of different ways to try and get them to speak. And I found that one of the techniques I used was country music, and I would, because country music, typically most songs tell a story, and it's something they can relate to. And so you'd get them, the class, you know, maybe reading a line, each student, until eventually they've read all the lines in the song, and then you keep going over it, and eventually you get to the point where I would play the music, and now all of a sudden they could hear it and it was musical, and you would pretty soon hear them singing along with the song, and it was kind of a unique way to get them to feel comfortable to be able to speak English. Even though their pronunciation may not be perfect, that didn't really matter. What mattered, it was the effort to try to speak, and that's the difference with conversational English versus formal English. And they had, Milford Daily News had done a story on me for my trips, and the one had happened to be in Chisinau, Moldova. And in the interview, which I didn't think they were going to print, but they did, you know, they were asking me, like, why are you doing this? And I mentioned that, you know, life had changed a lot. You looked at things differently. And I basically said that, you know, someday God is going to take me. He's going to take all of us one day. But it damn well wasn't going to be laying on the couch doing nothing. And I never expected those words to be put in there. But that was my attitude, was that you can't just lay around and do nothing. You had to do something. So I spent 3 or 4 years, 3 months at a time, or maybe 6 months at a time, teaching and working with groups, mostly in Chisinau, Moldova. It became my favorite place, and 2 groups in particular. One group was a lot of mixed heritage children, and unfortunately fathers had disappeared, and so there was mothers trying to raise these mixed heritage children. And in a country like Moldova, there's very little support for that. So an organization that tried to help them was really something that was worthwhile. And I had done some fundraising back here in the States. So one summer we I raised about $4,000, and we sent every child in that organization to summer camp for a week that wanted to go or that could go. There was no one left behind. The other group that I worked with were all children, young adults that had either through accident or by birth or whatever were wheelchair bound. And I think that gives you an amazing insight on how people can cope. To watch them play wheelchair soccer or wheelchair basketball and see how they can whip around the floor and handle that ball, it's simply amazing. And I think it makes you appreciate what you have in life a lot more.
Any last things that you'd like to share about your military experience and what you've learned, what you've taken from it before we wrap up, Wayne?
Well, I know in times of war, I don't think anyone likes to see their child go into the military, no matter what it is. But in peace times, which I consider basically we're close to at this point in time, little activity in Afghanistan, and hopefully we're not going to get involved in anything else. I think the military experience is fantastic, and something that if I had a son, I would have encouraged them to go into the military. My whole career, my life, was a result of my training that I received in the military, and my ability to venture into foreign countries, not knowing their language, but being able to get along with gestures and learning a few words. And you find there's a lot of people that are learning a lot of English words. So it gave me a great outlook and a great experience, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing these stories with us, Wayne. Now, we've been speaking today with Wayne Morey, veteran of the U.S. Navy. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks to ABMI for their support of this project. We will be sending copies of all the interviews in this project to the Library of Congress to become part of the permanent record there. Any veteran who has ties to Bellingham or Mendon is encouraged to contact us to arrange to be interviewed here at ABMI Cable 8. Please call the station at 508-966-3234 or email me, Marjorie Turner Holman, at marjorieturner.com. The phone number for the station and my email will be in the credits at the end of the program. Each person's story is unique. We'd love to hear them. Thank you.
You're welcome.